Welcome, everyone. Very pleased to have you all with us here today for This Is CDR, an online event series presented by Open Air to explore the wide range of carbon dioxide removal solutions currently being researched, developed, and deployed. And to contextualize them for policy proposals, Open Air has under development for New York and other states and localities. Just some quick background on Open Air. We're a distributed volunteer network dedicated to the advancement of CDR solutions essential to solving the climate crisis. We're a global community, and we collaborate on shared open source missions in the areas of policy advocacy and research and development. There should be some info in the chat about how you can get involved with us, a link to our website where there's a form you can fill out to join our group, and would love to have you be a part of what we're doing. Quick background on carbon dioxide removal, which is what we're here to talk about today. Many of you are familiar with CDR, the practice of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and durably storing it in geological, terrestrial, or ocean reservoirs or in long-lived products. One thing when we're considering CDR as we are here today and with this series, it's essential first and foremost to emphasize that CDR is not in any way an alternative to reducing emissions. We must reduce global emissions and decarbonize our economy as quickly and as completely as possible, full stop. That said, every credible climate forecast, including in very stark terms, the most recent IPCC assessment report, show that carbon dioxide removal will be required at gigaton scale, that's billions of tons per year by mid-century, to counteract the emissions that are difficult or inequitable to abate, to counteract emissions that are slow to abate, like India just announced that they're going to not decarbonize to net zero until 2070, and then ultimately to start removing the tremendous excess of anthropogenic carbon dioxide already in the atmosphere so we can restore our climate to a safer and healthier state. If you're new to CDR, our previous This Is CDR sessions are a great place to start, and there are a link to those recordings in the chat. There's also a resource here on screen that we have, the Carbon Dioxide Removal Primer, which is a great sort of textbook for carbon dioxide removal written by many of the great experts in the field. And a couple other links we'll put in the chat to talk about it. Everyone, if you haven't already, please introduce yourself in the chat and tell us where you're zooming in from. I think I forgot to introduce myself, but I'm Toby Bryce, based in Brooklyn, New York, and I work on CDR policy advocacy with Open Air. And this week, we're really pleased and excited to have with us one of the leaders in the CDR space, Marty Odlin, to tell us how Running Tide, his company, is employing technology and automated systems to grow and deploy kelp for permanent carbon sequestration in the deep ocean. A couple housekeeping notes. Marty's going to give a 10-15 minute presentation. We have a few prepared questions for him, and then the bulk of the program will be moderated audience Q&A. So as we go along, please type any questions you have into the Zoom Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen. We're going to be doing the questions in the Q&A and not the chat, just to kind of keep things organized. So please try to put your questions there. You had to, I believe, click on this to come on, but this event is being recorded, and we will be sending the video link to everyone who registered, and we'll also post it to our website and our YouTube channel. And additionally, we will be live tweeting today's event. The Twitter link should be in the chat. Please follow along, and if you want to comment or get involved in the conversation, the hashtag is #ThisIsCDR. And again, our Twitter should be in the chat, and you can just follow that. Now for the main event and why we're all here. Marty Odlin is the founder and CEO of Running Tide, a Maine-based company seeking to harness, accelerate, and scale the most impactful restorative processes naturally at work in the ocean to build a climate-positive future. Marty studied robotics at Dartmouth, was a director here in New York at Columbia's Center for Sustainable Engineering. He's managed a fleet of 5 fishing boats, and his family has been in the offshore fishing business for generations. I'm very excited to learn from Marty today. And Marty, please hop on, and I will unshare so you can share your screen, and I look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Toby, for inviting me, and appreciate the opportunity to communicate about our proposed CDR solution. Just for a little bit of background on our company, we formed in 2017. We've had a fairly broad mandate inside the company to be looking for scalable climate adaptation and mitigation solutions in the ocean. I was lucky enough to work at Columbia University for a while and came into contact with a bunch of the early carbon removal discussions, found it fascinating, saw the necessity of it at the time. Then as I moved through my career, it just kind of never left my head about how important carbon removal was going to be. And when I had the opportunity to set up a company, in running tide, I knew that carbon removal is going to play a really important role in the future of our company. And so, long story short, this is a solution that's been probably about 10 years in incubation. We've been working steadily towards it for the past 4 years. And then as the awareness of CDR in a marketplace started to develop over the past 18 months, we've been able to accelerate the resources we're putting into the solutions and the study of these solutions. Really excited by the opportunities afforded by the Stripe and Shopify programs, and really heartened to see a market starting to develop in a bunch of different locations for permanent carbon removal. So to get to the crux of it, everyone is aware, hopefully everyone in this is aware of just how fast carbon levels have increased in the atmosphere. A rough way to think about it is the damage done by carbon in the atmosphere is like the area under the curve. So as emissions keep climbing and as the amount of carbon in the atmosphere keeps growing, the duration of that carbon in the atmosphere is going to be reflected in how much damage is done and how much warming we see. So the IPCC report made it really clear, without massive carbon removal, the world will essentially burn. A plus 1.5 degrees C future is actually a pretty terrifying proposition. And the only way we get there is with 450 gigatons of carbon removal, which is pretty astonishing amount of mass transfer. A 1.5 degrees C, people should be really aware that plus 1.5 degrees C means the environment that you see out your window, wherever you might be, will radically change in a plus 1.5 C environment. Some places more than others, but just generally speaking, you're going to see a wholesale disruption of native ecosystems, hardiness zones shifting, et cetera. So we're going to see like a totally radical change in our natural environment, even in a 1.5 degrees C scenario, which is going to be pretty hard to achieve when you look at the scale that we need to operate at. We have to find solutions at the scale of that problem. So, 450 gigatons is an abstract number, but it's just what the simple way to imagine it is it's 150 years of the fossil fuel industry in reverse in 20 to 25 years. It's by necessity, it's going to be the largest mass transfer in history, purposeful mass transfer in history. You can see here, this is the Troll A oil rig in Norway. And I always like to show people this just to understand that we have to do this. This is the level of scale that these carbon removal solutions are going to have to operate at. 450 gigatons is a massive amount, and we're going to have to do massive projects to make that a reality. We want to find the leverage points, and we want to be as elegant as possible in searching out for efficiencies in these processes. But it's just important for people to understand that we're talking about the industrial removal of carbon. And even solutions like ours, which leverage nature, it's still an industrial level interaction with nature. And it's just an important thing to contextualize as we start talking about some of the other factors that people are really concerned about, like costs, risks, capital outlay, et cetera. The necessity of the problem is industrial scale interface with nature at the very least. So at Running Tide, like that's the background, the contextualization of some of Running Tide's efforts. Our aim is to harness the ocean and to build a climate positive future. What we do as a company for carbon removal, the solution that we've kind of focused our efforts on. I just want to be clear. I think there's probably dozens of good ocean CDR ideas, potential solutions. As a company, you can pick a couple to really chase down. At Running Tide, we thought what we could do best was to grow macroalgae and sink it in the deep ocean. It's an elegant solution relative to some of the other ocean CDR solutions. It's highly measurable. Relative to other carbon removal solutions, we get a lot of leverage over the energy requirements because we're using ocean currents, the sun and gravity to remove carbon from the top layer of the ocean and transport it to the deep layer of the ocean. So, but like I said, there's potentially dozens of potential solutions that I think should all be chased down. That brings up probably a broader point. I think that there's hundreds potentially of good solutions for carbon removal full stop across land and sea. And I think all of them deserve a massive amount of support relative to the amount of support they're getting right now from governments. And hopefully we'll be able to chase down the best solutions. Permanent carbon removal or permanent carbon storage in the deep ocean. There's an area at about 1,000 meters deep where there's not a lot of mixing in the ocean. So this is, oceanographers will want a high degree of precision here, but just in general, the way people can think about the ocean is we get like a lot of mixing in the top layer of the ocean, and the top layer of the ocean is in relative, over certain timescales, it's in relative balance with the atmosphere. So the carbon dioxide, as carbon dioxide increases in the atmosphere, it reaches equilibrium with the top layer of the ocean. There is not a lot of mixing below the thermocline at 1,000 meters deep. So as carbon, if you can transport carbon from the top layer of the ocean below the thermocline, you get a high degree of permanence. In a lot of areas of the ocean, in the areas we specifically target, you can get 800 plus years of sequestration. There are areas of the ocean where if you transported carbon from the upper layer of the ocean to the lower, to the below the thermocline, it could come up on an upwelling. So this has to be done in, with an understanding of kind of the 4-dimensional map of ocean currents. But generally speaking, if you can move carbon from the top layer of the ocean below the thermocline, you get 800 years of permanence. So, our solution where we're growing kelp and what we call microforests, they could be one of the world's most efficient carbon removal systems, provided certain assumptions hold to be true, certain assumptions that we've modeled hold to be true as we do in situ measurements. The final point I'd like to make is, when we think about material flows, we think about how much mass do we have to move to remove carbon. No matter how you slice it, just moving mass takes up energy. And the minimal amount of mass that can be moved to remove the maximum amount of carbon is like a good way to formulate some mental models around how efficient a carbon removal technology could be. For us, our solutions involve seeding a minimal amount of mass that we set free into the ocean that absorbs a lot of carbon by using like a biologic, the kelp. That allows us to get a really efficient mass transfer rate, and it's the reason why we think this is going to be probably the more efficient, or one of the more efficient ocean-based carbon removal systems. As we're talking about just massive scale carbon removal on the gigaton level, when we talk about with the IPCC report, I think on the 450 gigaton level, we have to understand that there's going to be a wide range of solutions. There is no silver bullet, and it's probably going to take dozens of solutions that are kind of scaled up, and then out of the hundreds of good ideas, maybe dozens will scale up to be beyond megaton storage, and then out of those there'll be a few that can scale up to potentially gigaton. I think that the ocean probably can handle a huge amount of carbon removal without ill effect. But I think that it's really important that we go relatively slowly, no matter what. This is all going to be slow, but and study each stage of the process to make sure that we don't inadvertently trip over some negative feedback loops that we could see in any ecosystems. And that goes for land as well as sea-based solutions. So happy to answer any future questions. That's it.
Great. Awesome. Thank you, Marty. That's fantastic. Yeah, definitely. I have a few questions that we kind of prepared in advance, and then it looks like a bunch of audience questions are coming in. First, can we back up a little bit? And I'd love to drill down a little bit more into the sort of running tide origin story. Can you talk about, first of all, I guess, how what you're doing relates to I guess it relates indirectly to fishing, but more directly potentially to the aquaculture business that Running Tide operates? And then number two, can you talk a little bit about how, you've been thinking about CDR, based on Dartmouth and Columbia. Where did the like specific Eureka moment come to you to basically start seeding kelp on land and then floating it out into the deep ocean to let it grow there and then sequester?
Okay, sure. I'll answer that last question first. I don't think there was a Eureka moment. I think we started we started with the broad goal of just figuring out what would a scalable carbon removal solution look like in the ocean as a team. Or, myself, it's like, what problem are you trying to solve? That's the problem we're trying to solve. And I think it came through a process of just refinement, trying to remove as much material and energy from the process as possible, and trying to get as much leverage off biological systems as we can. I think broadly, you're looking at carbon removal is going to come down to turning, you have to take something from a very low energy state and bring it into a high energy state. One way to think about all the carbon that's in the atmosphere is we kind of released a spring. So all the carbon was in a spring, in fossil fuels, and we kind of released it. And now we have to put a bunch of energy back into the system in order to put that carbon back into a spring. And so it's all about just finding leverage points, like what natural systems, what natural power systems can we leverage to push that spring back down. One of my favorite CDR companies that I've seen is Noya. They're using cooling towers, existing cooling towers to do carbon removal. I think that's like brilliant, right? There's already a bunch of mass moving and they're like tapping into that. So it's sort of, they're getting leverage off an existing system to close that spring back down. For us, we're using sun, ocean currents, and gravity to do the work.
Yeah.
So anyway, it was just a process of refinement. We just had to really, define the problem, and then the team worked together. There's no Eureka moment. It didn't come from solely my head or solely anyone else's head. It was just a team effort. We have a very multidisciplinary team, and as we just slowly kept dematerializing, we ended up with the solution.
And can you tell the audience a little bit about your Running Tide's oyster aquaculture business and
Sure.
where they can find those oysters and relate to the Running Tide?
Yeah.
I can't remember, what is the name? Like if you're in a restaurant in Brooklyn, what is the name, or Portland or whatever, what is the name of the oyster?
Well, it depends on which farm we're on, but Avalon right now is in New York.
Okay.
Chelsea Market has some Avalon oysters and clams. So when we started Running Tide, 2017 sounds like not long ago, but it is quite a long time ago when it comes to carbon removal, right? 18 months ago, when I'd be talking to employees or investors or pretty much anybody in the world, no one knew what carbon removal was. They thought it was kind of this really abstract concept. It's been really exciting over the past 18 months to see how wide awareness has grown. So in 2017, when we started our company, we knew that we wanted to get into carbon removal, but we didn't know when that market was going to happen. So we built the company on, essentially a shellfish business adjacent, it's very adjacent business to growing kelp. And we built that business up with the idea that we'd be able to scale up shellfish growing, but also enable us to do large scale coastal restoration efforts. There's a huge problem with a lack of coastal shellfish and kelp biomass, or we're well below historic baselines. So we thought that was a really fun and interesting problem that we could solve, that would build up all the tools, techniques, and infrastructure and team that would be necessary to do the carbon removal.
Got it.
So it was just sort of a thoughtful way to get into carbon, to build up the capacity to do carbon removal without actually doing carbon removal until there was a market for it.
Right.
So
it does create leverage both in terms of potentially cash flow and also operations and infrastructure.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, like most of the back end and enabling systems, whether it's like data collection platforms, sensors, software systems, even a lot of the hardware systems port over. So it was a way to just build up all that capacity, which is probably one of the reasons why we've been able to, I'd hesitate to say we're leaders in the space, but how we've been able to make some quick progress is because we've actually built up all the capacity over years, right? There's years and years of effort to build up the capacity, and then now we're just kind of seeing the effects of that.
That's great. I just wanted to highlight that because I personally think it's super cool.
Appreciate
One note, you mentioned Noya, and I should say that Noya, Josh Santos from Noya, is going to be presenting in Marty's chair in, I believe, 4 weeks, and there's a link to that
great.
in the chat, and we're super excited about what Noya is doing as well. I've heard you talk, and you and I have talked briefly about the idea of marine permaculture, and obviously there are a lot of co-benefits associated with marine permaculture, but did you think about marine permaculture at some point during your journey into getting to the idea that you have? And maybe can you talk about it as a CDR solution, and maybe what are some of the issues with scale? And I remember one thing that you said to me is that the ocean likes to break big things, and
ocean likes to break everything. Yeah.
So I think like your solution, which is floating the biomass out and letting it grow in the ocean, leveraging currents, et cetera, and also all of space in the ocean, versus a marine permaculture where you have to like fix the biomass in one place and sustain it there. Can you talk a little bit about the pros and cons there?
Sure.
Obviously it's a good thing, but as a CDR solution, maybe what are some of the issues with it?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think marine permaculture is probably one of the things I'm most passionate about in the world. I think it's a beautiful idea to be able to repopulate these coastal shellfish beds and kelp forests as a way to manage nutrient flows off land, provide habitat, do local ocean acidification buffering, and to provide food sources for people and animals. I think it's an absolutely beautiful idea. I think it's tricky to make arguments for permanent carbon removal, but that doesn't mean it's like something my company does. It's something that I believe very strongly, and it's just, there needs to be some level of discipline around the carbon removal solutions and the level of permanence that they're able to provide, and therefore that will affect the price that the carbon removal credits will be able to fetch on a market. I think we're seeing it emerge already, but there's going to be like quality differences in how much a carbon credit is worth, right? Based on permanence, additionality, any other factors that might come in. It's going to be very similar to like corporate debt markets, the fish market, real estate. You can package these things up and you can create indices that reflect prices, but there's also idiosyncrasies with every different product, and how that all gets boiled out into like some cost curve relative to the different qualities will let us know whether ethereal or like temporary carbon storage is viable as something that could is viable as like as an industrial effort, as a business that can sustain itself, versus just has to be subsidized. I think it's worthy of subsidy, marine permaculture, but
right.
I think it's too early to say what price those like sort of more temporary credits could fetch to say whether it could be a viable carbon removal business on its own. There'd have to be some other subsidy or some other pricing mechanism to make them super viable, at least with our understanding right now.
Right.
And I don't want that to be like exclusionary towards these ideas. I think they're fantastic and they need to get turned over, and hopefully someone can create some solutions around them that scale.
Yeah, I think open air, we totally agree. Like blue carbon and forest carbon are unalloyed goods, but perhaps not incentivized via carbon markets as they're currently operating.
That's exactly right.
Okay, a couple hardball questions.
Sure.
We're big fans of your friends from Ocean Visions, and they gave us they were our first Ocean CDR presentation back in August, and kind of gave us an overview of different Ocean CDR pathways. This may have already been put in the chat, but I guess a month or so ago, maybe 2 months ago, they put out a progress report. They're helping you assess your solution in various ways. And just a couple questions on that. Can you speak to where you think your solution is currently and where you think it might get to at scale in terms of both the life cycle analysis and MRV, measurement, reporting, and verification? So like, what is the carbon efficiency of your process? per ton sequestered? And then also on the MRV, like obviously you're not going to measure every ton of kelp you ever produce, but how do you get to a point where you can give buyers and market security as to what the sequestration is going to be per ton of biomass or whatever the right metric is?
Sure. On the MRV side, I mean, that's relatively easy to answer. I'm not going to get into too many specifics. Like our specific protocols will be published in accordance with our research partners as we're able to assess them out. But I can say that what we're going to do is a combination of like really sophisticated and large scale modeling efforts with in situ measurements. In situ means in the environment. So we're going to be measuring a lot of these farms directly out in the open ocean, and then combining that with some, and using that to like back check some larger scale modeling efforts. So what we'll do is, what that means is effectively we'll have a bunch of sensors out there on a subset of the farms. We'll collect a ton of information as these farms grow. We'll go out and measure them, and then we'll compare that to the models that we've built. And provided there isn't too much variance, we'll be able to make tighter and tighter models that will, and we're quite confident that we'll be able to build models that will satisfy the verification requirements of customers.
And are you able to, and you may not want to, but are you able to answer like where you see the carbon efficiency per ton?
Oh yeah, it's going to be
carbon sequestered in the deep ocean.
Sure, way north of 90% in terms of carbon in versus carbon out. We're way above 90%.
And I've seen this written elsewhere, but like what is so per ton of biomass of kelp that gets grown, what is the ratio of the carbon that gets sequestered?
Oh, it's actually highly variant across species, depending on wet weight versus dry weight. Wet weight to it's basically you could think of like 10%. It's probably like a good like middle of the road number across a bunch of stuff would be like wet weight to carbon removed.
Got it.
But that's like highly variant. Like, I mean, I could show you the list. Listen, like there's reams of data. It's all over the place, depending on species, et cetera.
Understood. And one other aspect of the Great Ocean Visions work in your board there, can you talk a little bit about what the potential harms are from your process that have come up that third parties are concerned about, or at least the valid ones, and your thoughts on them and how they might be mitigated?
I mean, I can say that like, no matter what, I think this is a really important point. No matter what, the world is going to look a lot different in 2050. Like the physical world around us is going to look a lot different in 2050. It's either going to be done by us, like by humanity, we're going to do it purposefully, or it's going to be done to us based on the legacy emissions, right? The world's going to change radically. So I think that there is a precautionary principle for all of these things is absolutely warranted, but it needs to be contextualized against like status quo is disaster. So I think that there's a lot of people who kind of don't see the world that way. And, that's a shame. But I think the IPCC report makes it very clear that the consensus of science is that our status quo is like to do tremendous violence to the natural world and to future generations if we don't do anything. So I'm all for the precautionary principle being applied to carbon removal efforts, but I think that it needs to be contextualized against what the status quo truly is and what it represents. Yeah. So, okay, that's like a long way. That's a preamble. Right. That's a preamble to saying that, we are absolutely obsessed with ocean health as a company and ocean and preserving biodiversity. So I think that as a company and as a group of people, including the partners that we've engaged. So we've engaged outside Help Ocean Visions for one, Cambridge University as others, and there's many more in the pipeline that we're engaging to make sure that we're taking an absolute holistic view on this. We have no intention of doing anything that would cause undue harm to the ocean. I think that probably the concern I've heard the most is the impact of introducing this much biomass into the benthic regions of the ocean. So that's like what would happen at the ocean bottom. And so I'll just address that one. I mean, I can address all of them, but
there's like flotsam and jetsam, but all that.
Yeah, exactly. But, you know, there's going to be lots of concerns, and they're all look, all these concerns are valid. We take them all very seriously, but I'll address the deep ocean one, or the introduction of biomass to the deep ocean. So there is a preponderance of evidence that the transport of carbon from the ocean surface to the deep ocean has slowed down. It's an existing massive flux of carbon into the deep ocean, and most of the evidence is that it's slowed down. Like, one of the mechanisms by which it's slowed down is there's a lot less whales than there used to, and whales, through their swimming action, transports a lot of carbon to the deep ocean. It also upwells a lot of nutrients, which increases phytoplankton levels. Plus, there's the whale bodies that deadfall. Some people think that we've actually lost like an astonishing amount of carbon removal due to the loss of whale biomass. There's also the loss of coastal kelp forests, right? Which, you know, there's quite a bit of variance in the models, but it could be, we've lost anywhere from 100 to 200 megatons of carbon removal due to the loss of coastal kelp forests. And that's sequestration through the thermocline. And then further, the third point is that phytoplankton levels appear to be dropping and could potentially drop by an astonishing amount. Those dead phytoplankton also sink below the thermocline. So if anything, the deep, and then this is all like very site dependent, right? This is not a blanket statement about the wide ocean, but just, I think we could say that in general, there's been a loss of carbon flux across the thermocline. And if Running Tide or like companies are able to accelerate that, there's probably a long time before we're actually able to exceed the historic baseline of biomass that's entering into that ecosystem. You know, one concern, and the other beauty or system thing that we've designed into the system is that we're going to be dispersing these over massive areas. So it's not like there's just going to be this like bomb of biomass just lands in like this 1 square mile of the entire ocean. This stuff's going to be spread out very evenly across huge swaths of the ocean. So it'll be very unlikely that you're going to see any crazy acute effects. And if anything, probably just helping to rebuild some of those ecosystems of the deep ocean floor that rely on marine snow.
Got it.
Hopefully that's satisfying. Hopefully that satisfies. There's a lot of caveats. It's a complex place, but I think that in general, we feel pretty comfortable that for at least like a few years, there's almost like no way we could have any significant effect. And, you know, we'll be studying it, and we're engaged in efforts with researchers to study all these effects. And if we do find something that's happening that doesn't balance out the benefit, you know, we'll have to stop doing it. That's just, I think that's
but I guess practically speaking, that's the one that seems to me like there's no way for us to know what the effect of dropping megatons and gigatons of biomass carbon into the deep ocean. But we do know it's going to happen by 2050 if we do nothing. So how do you balance it?
I wouldn't say that there's no way to know, because what you're looking at in the deep ocean is I mean, aside from some thermal vents on the deep ocean, like you're looking at an ecosystem that relies on energy in the form of carbon falling to the deep ocean, right? So we actually know what that system looks like with a tremendous amount of carbon fluxing into it. Now, yeah, we have to spend a lot of time like modeling out what incremental increase to that flux would be, but it's not an unknowable thing. I mean, we can model these things out, and we can do some measurements, and we can figure it out eventually. In the short term, though, there's going to be it's almost going to be impossible, because we're going to measure some of this stuff, because we're going to be at such tiny scales relative to what the ocean already does.
Right. Are there policy obstacles for you to deploy at scale? Like, are there, whether permitting issues or regulations, and at like local, state, national, international levels, or can you just go do this?
No. I mean, I think that's the international community is, I think, in the process. I think there's a lot of conversations happening right now in developing frameworks around ocean CDR. So there are, the obstacles are that there isn't a pathway. It's not that it just doesn't exist, right? This is carbon removal is something that unfortunately hasn't been addressed over the past 30 years at any relevant scale, whether it's by the international community, just hasn't been addressed. And so now people are starting to address it. I would say that it absolutely is a bottleneck to scale. And those pathways, whether they're local, state, regional, international, need to be addressed. But I would say that that's very, that comes down to how much of a priority carbon removal is to society, right? I think like direct air capture plants, mineralization projects, forestry projects, or any number of different awesome carbon removal projects that need to exist are going to face, whether it's local, state, federal, international permitting issues. It's just like, bureaucracy isn't great at pushing novel projects forward. So I think it's an opportunity for political leadership in this country and internationally to, prioritize these types of projects and help clear the way, either create new permitting frameworks or just help clear out red tape, such that these projects can move forward because they are critical to the future.
And for Running Tide, is it primarily the international? Is it called the International Ocean Dumping Treaty that you're up against, or are there also national, state, and local issues that you have to address? Because you're it's most of what you are actually doing.
I mean, it depends. Like, I mean, what we're talking. Yeah, I think all of the above, right? All of the above need to be addressed in terms of I'd say that there's all levels of government need to be aligned behind whether it's ocean or land-based CDR. I don't think we're unique in that. I think that pretty much everyone's going to have the same set of problems broadly. For ocean CDR, I think that it depends on the specific technology and depends on the scope of the operation. So local permitting issues are probably not that big of a deal when we're at really small scale, because the footprint we have locally is almost minimal. But as any of these systems scale up, they're going to be having local, state, regional, and international level effects. So permitting pathways need to be established, I think, across all levels of government to make sure that these projects can move forward at pace. I think we do have to look at this as sort of like a wartime mobilization, and it needs to be an extremely high level of priority for every level of government to make sure that these projects can move forward.
Got it. I think that's a good closing line, the wartime mobilization. For the prepared questions, Megha is going to hop on, and we have tons of audience questions, so she's going to marshal those and kind of start hitting you with
Hey, yes, tons of questions. So maybe first of all, could you just talk a little bit about how you choose locations and sites and kind of what are the considerations that go into picking the right kind of place to do this?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a few things. There's carbon efficiency of the system. So you have to model out supply chains, proximity to ports, et cetera. We want to make sure deployment locations are optimally situated relative to the efficiency of the operation. That's where we deploy, where we drop the systems into the water. Then we need to have an appropriate trajectory. So these things drift in the ocean, and they need to go through the Goldilocks zone, I would say, of temperature, nutrients, et cetera, out in the open ocean. Actually, let me back up really quickly. Like the deep ocean is, when people think about the ocean, they think of this big homogeneous thing, which is not the case at all. It's like this kaleidoscope of different currents and temperature bands and nutrients and upwellings and downwellings. And the task for us is to model that, understand where to go, where to drop them, such that the farms stay in the Goldilocks zone and then end over an appropriate area where we can drop it below the thermocline and we'll see a high degree of permanence, like i.e. not close to a coastal upwelling zone or anything like that. Yeah. So a tremendous amount of modeling and in situ measurement of ocean currents, et cetera, which like feeds back to our model. So we pick it through a tremendous amount of monitoring and modeling and to make sure that we're achieving good growth, like good carbon accumulation to the farms, and then also they're being dropped below the thermocline in appropriate locations for relative to permanence.
Right. Okay. And so would you sort of grow them in more coastal areas where there's more nutrients, or is it further out in the deep ocean, or is it kind of more of a complicated set of factors than just those things?
Yeah, it's a more complicated set of factors than that. But yeah, generally these are, it's not very efficient to grow and then add energy into transport. There's quite a bit of drag on kelp, so it's not something you can really tow that well.
Okay. You just have to.
You got to make sure that, yeah, you got to have the ocean do as much of the work as possible.
Oops, sorry. Yeah, so it's all about picking the right spot based on the modeling. Mm-hmm. Okay. Could you talk a little bit about MRV? And I think particularly people had questions about, how do you make sure it all really sinks, that it's not eaten by attracting different organisms, that it doesn't degrade at the surface, things like that.
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic question. We monitor it, right? We use sensors to monitor the growth, and we're only counting what we transport below the thermocline, and we can do that through, we can monitor a statistically significant subset of the micro farms and make sure that they're behaving how we expect, but we're not counting anything that doesn't sink below the thermocline. That's what the biomass that gets below the thermocline, or the carbon embodied in the biomass. And the carbon embodied in the farms, what sinks below the thermocline is what we count. We're not counting anything that breaks away or gets eaten or whatever. So
okay, yeah, makes sense. And someone asked, why choose to sink the kelp instead of harvesting it, kind of trying to turn it into products? Biogas was mentioned and things like that, as kind of also a revenue pathway, or how did you think about that consideration?
Yeah, well, I've seen a lot of things get harvested out of the ocean. I can tell you that it's a complex operation to collect things that are widely dispersed in the ocean and bring them back to port. There's a tremendous amount of energy in that. From a thermodynamics perspective, you're taking something at a low energy state that's spread out, and you have to add a bunch of energy to bring it back to shore. So, how we think about that kelp is it's inaccessible for those purposes. Like, the economics don't work.
Makes sense.
The system's not suited for that, basically.
Yeah.
And the area that we're doing this, it's not a great, like, I would not do that much in the open ocean if your goal, like deep ocean, if your goal was to retrieve it and harvest it. It's better to do that close to a port. So it's just different.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
We had a few questions about the idea of nutrient robbing. So the idea that, this might be competing with other things in the biological pump in terms of, things like phosphate or nitrate in the surface ocean. Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, I think that's something that's a potential drawback at a certain level of scale, right? I think that we're going to be able to get there, and it's something that, is in constant. I think that's one of those things where it's like, okay, what's the quality of the carbon credit? And that's something that we don't have. I actually don't think the data exists to be able to make this definitive answers at any massive scale. On a small scale, it's not going to be. It's not an issue at all. We feel really confident about that. And when I say small scale, like small scale relative to the size of the problem, like. But that's something that, like, we're engaged heavily with Cambridge University, and we're sharing data, we're pushing out special sensors and doing a bunch of experiments, and all of that will be, the results of that effort will be announced as we have definitive answers. I would say that at a small scale, it's just really unlikely that we're going to see any additionality concerns. It might be something we bump up against at truly massive scale. I mean, at some point, all of these Earth systems are going to have carrying capacity limitations and additionality concerns. So it's just a function of, being aware of that and being aware of that limitation, and then studying and sharing data and assessing it as we get there. So I would say it's a cause for concern, but at a massive scale, and we're engaged in those efforts to collect that information and to present it to the world, such that what we're doing should be judged on its merits of additionality. It shouldn't be, it's not something that I'm trying to hide. It's something that I think is actually will get priced in the future. I think as these carbon markets develop, additionality concerns, permanence concerns will all get priced into the price to the quality of the carbon credit.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, a couple of people asked about sort of the carbon markets and how this plays into that, how you guys are setting up the operation to work with carbon markets.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important that the carbon markets get developed and, with a degree of sophistication related to the quality of credits. And I think that we can start to see that. It's really exciting to see that that's starting to get developed. I think that Stripe and Shopify are doing a fantastic job of being the market leaders there. And there's a bunch of other companies that are piling in and different type marketplace structures that could work. We're engaged on kind of all levels of that. We find, with the aim to make sure that these carbon markets are appropriately sophisticated to understand the nuance and the quality of different credits. And, it's not something that we're trying to necessarily manipulate beyond just making sure that the information about our system is out there. As we're able to have, more robust and, more peer-reviewed modeling efforts, we just, we'll be judged accordance to those and other potential solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a couple more. So in terms of like the legal standpoint and the permitting and things, how does that work in the sort of ocean environments you guys are operating in?
Say that one more time.
So just the legal and sort of permitting questions. Who do you have to get permissions from to set these up, if anyone?
Yeah, I mean, it's gonna be from the country of origin of any operation will be at least the way the legal frameworks are set up right now. That's who does it. There is no like international body that is like a permission granting organization for these types of efforts. So it'll happen country of origin and done through consensus. Done through a consensus of international organizations. It's really unfortunate, honestly, that I'd say this across the entire carbon removal community. It's just like, it's really unfortunate that the world didn't get these policy and policy frameworks in place like a long time ago. I think that's like, no one should get let off the hook for that. Like, I think that it's an oversight of insane magnitude that kind of the academic and policy communities didn't have this set up prior to the need being so dire. It's too bad. But hopefully, we can be part of fostering dialogue and solution generation Absolutely. In the policy space.
Yeah, definitely. I have two more. One is just, can you just talk a little bit about the different oxygen concentrations in the different ocean layers and how the amount of kelp that this might introduce will affect that?
Yeah, I mean, we're not going to have any material effect until we achieve an absolutely astonishing amount of scale. I think, I think that's basically trying to, I mean, what it will do is increase, I mean, in the most simplistic formulation, you're going to increase the amount of oxygen at the surface, potentially consume some in the deep ocean. But like I said, it's like, this would have to be one of the best carbon removal solutions in the world to have like a significant effect on sort of like the benthic ecosystem or whatever. Like we're spreading out over such a massive area, like it's going to be almost impossible to even measure any difference for a long, 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 long time. It's something definitely to study, and we'll model, and we're very aware that it's a concern, but it's also a long way down the road before that becomes even something that would be a limiter on the scale that could be achieved here.
Yeah, totally makes sense. And just to finish, I think quite a few people ask kind of what are your biggest challenges that you're facing in general and in terms of scaling up, and how can anyone watching this or who's interested in this kind of stuff get involved and help make this more of a reality?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I mean, the challenges we have are how hard it is to operate in the ocean environment and collect the data necessary. It's just not an easy place to work. And I'd say most of our challenges involve just deploying and maintaining sensor systems and feed us back the information necessary. I don't know if that's something that a ton of people can help us with. It's just
we have a lot of open air members who are into,
the ocean likes to break things. So I'd say that's the biggest challenge for us right now, because that's the gate for us. It's building up data sets around this stuff. And that's something I'm like, there's a lot of presumption that there can be a presumption in a lot of these questions, like this is not stuff that we're trying to measure. We're trying to measure all aspects of this, and keeping those systems working out in the ocean so that they're feeding back the appropriate information is like a challenge. So it's like the gate is data, and the challenge is to keep data systems flowing. And I think how people can help, is across all of CDR, is really put pressure on elected officials to make CDR a priority. I mean, decarbonization is absolutely critical, cannot be stressed enough. Like we need prices on carbon, like carbon tax, and we need pressure on decarbonization. I think that's like a great place for people to work, but we also need to put pressure on government elected officials to pour resources into CDR, because these production ramps are going to take a long time for all CDR solutions. And, there's probably 100 really good ideas that deserve an enormous amount of resources from the government, so that we can help assess, like, out of that 100, what couple dozen are going to scale past megaton, and then what, 4 or 5 are going to get to gigaton scale. So I just think the more resources need to get pushed into CDR, whether it's on developing, clearing out red tape to make sure these projects can get tested, and then pouring in resources to make sure that they're getting tested at an appropriate scale and that production ramps are getting built, such that when these solutions become validated, widely accepted, properly priced, an industrial ecosystem exists so that they can scale to their appropriate level. It's really important that that CDR in general is developed at maximum pace. So.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Marty. That was really great and super interesting to me. I'm just going to hand it back over to Toby, who will close us out and introduce what we're doing next week. Thanks.
Thank you, Megha. And Marty, thank you so much for being with us. We know you're super busy, and we really appreciate you spending an hour. It was fascinating, and we're very excited about what you're building, and would love to continue to watch it grow and support you in any way we can. So thank you very much. And just a couple of notes about what we have coming up. I'm going to reshare my screen here. Next week, these have all been on Tuesday at noon. And next week, because of COP26 scheduling issues, we are going to have CHARM on Monday at 1 p.m. Eastern time. So Peter Reinhardt from CHARM. We kind of have a great lineup coming up. I don't know if they're going to top Marty, but we have some good folks coming up. So we have CHARM on the 16th. Megha and I are going to be publicly premiering the CDR procurement policy that Open Air has been developing, which is just about ready to be introduced into the New York State Assembly, which we're very excited about, which is a very small first step into making it become a law. But as Marty referenced, governments are going to need to get involved supporting CDR in a big way to get it scaled. So this is a first step in that direction. So we're going to be outlining what the policy proposal is and getting your feedback and any questions you have, and would love to get you involved with that. We're taking US Thanksgiving week off, and then we have NOIA, which we talked about earlier, Josh Santos, DAC in cooling towers. December 7th, we have Sea Change, which is a very cool electrochemical ocean CDR process that's been developed out at UCLA that's also been supported by Stripe. And on the 14th, another ocean CDR process, planetary hydrogen up in Canada, which has been supported by Shopify and is super interesting as well, carbon negative hydrogen that also sequesters CO2. So lots of great stuff coming up, but most of all, thank you, Marty, for being with us, and really appreciate the audience for joining us, and thank you for all the great questions. We'll see you next Monday.